Teleportation will commence in 5 minutes. Do not leave any luggage unattended. Unattended luggage will be removed and destroyed. Attention, ladies and gentlemen. This is an announcement from Planet X31. Please take your seats. Teleportation will commence in 2 minutes.
To test the reactions of troops to atom bombs used in support of an attack.
Atoms, like each other, to different degrees. Possibly this is in the air,
Evening, Earthlings, and welcome to the Science and Cocktails. Science and Cocktails is an initiative taken in collaboration with the Niels Bohr Institute that tries to bring scientific research directly to the people without interference of any other type of intermediate media. It tries to create a night culture that evolves around knowledge, entertainment, discussion, cocktails, and art. Tonight's lecture will be given by Jesper Hoffmeyer. Jesper Hoffmeyer is an author and professor emeritus at the Biological Department of Copenhagen University. His talk will be about biosemiotics, the processes whereby living systems identify and interpret environmental states or events as signs. Later, Soren Linkso, also known as Vectral, electronic music composer and visual designer, will do live manipulation of 3D graphics triggered by precise sounds. Abstract thoughts will be transcribed into images by the artist Henrik Schütz. And
give an applause to Jesper Hoffmeyer.
Hello.
Well, I succeeded in entering the scene. That's the first good step. Now, yeah, this is probably foreign to everybody here, and so it's not that it's difficult. It's just that it's foreign. Please remember. So my plan is to run through those 6 points. First, a little bit about what a surface is. I will then go to some philosophical things, realism, semiotic realism. I'll present what biosemiotics is about. Then I'll try to introduce an understanding of the self as history. I will talk about how nature became minded, and perhaps I'll also have time for talking about how the human body became minded, or what it is. So, the first point, transcending substance. Now, the question is this: do surfaces exist? I would say a surface is a place. It consists of neither matter nor molecules. It is just where two things meet. By that I mean, in the surface itself is just a border between two things. There are no surface molecules. There are no water molecules which are surface molecules. It's just either water or air, or you have a certain density, of course, of water molecules in one phase, and then you have a certain density, much lesser, in the air phase. But the surface as such is not part of that. It's not part of substance. And yet the surface is very real. A philosopher I know, who is a Peirce scholar, Alphonse Peirce, once wrote it this way, explained it this way: anyone who has ever had to flee the police knows just how real is the unreal boundary between Texas and Oklahoma. The boundary is, as you may know, in the middle of a river, Red River, as I understand, but everything is dealt with differently on the sides of that boundary. And yet, the boundary, of course, was just drawn on the map. It's just something which was drawn on the map. So the boundary, again, is a surface. It doesn't really exist, but it's very real. And of course, some of you know about surface tension, which makes this little insect I don't know the English name. In Danish it's skøjteløber. It's just carried there. There's a physical explanation for that phenomena. I won't go into that because I'm not a physicist, but it's not very difficult. So the most important surface in our life, of course, is the skin. It's an enormous organ. If you take my body just and cut up, and spread the skin out on this floor, it would be some 1-2 square meters. And yet it contains 60,000 kilometers of nerve threads. It contains so many blood things and so much. It's probably the most interesting organ in biology. Now, it is the skin that gives us the experience of belonging in the world. Because of the skin, the world can be touched. And of course, the idea of the skin is to keep the world away physically, but present psychologically. So it's away physically, but present psychologically. That's a very interesting thing. How can anything do that? And that's probably the deepest problem of biology, I think. Strangely enough, you don't see any treatise on this problem. That's what I'm trying to do. Let's stay there. So, in a way, if you should say what is most interesting about life is this, that it has an inside, that somehow always is very interested in the outside. So this asymmetry between an inside and an outside is what distinguishes life from non-life. This is what is the most, probably the most prominent feature of life. Another very prominent feature of life is anticipation. All living systems somehow manage an anticipation. If they didn't, they would die. Even the little bacterium, the most simple organism we have, is capable of deciding whether it should swim right or swim left, depending on where the concentration of nutrient would be highest. So it anticipates that by changing the movement of its flagella, the little whips it used to swim with, it can get to the food. That is anticipation. A stone or a rock would not anticipate. Clouds don't anticipate anything. Living systems anticipate. That's what we have to explain. Oh, I'll skip that over. Because this is only the introduction, and I shouldn't spend too much time on it. So, my claim in the book I wrote recently, and here would be, that experiences are related to neuronal processes. Something like the surface of the sea is related to the sea. The surface of the sea does not consist of water. It doesn't. And experiences do not consist of neuronal processes, no matter what the neurologists tell you. It does not. The psyche, I think you could say the psyche in English, couldn't you? The psyche, which I don't mean any psychic phenomena, I just mean the mental thing, should be seen as an interface. Maybe you can read it in red, I can see. The psyche should be seen as an interface through which a human organism manages coupling with the surrounding web of its natural and social world. So, this is, in a way, perhaps the whole lecture. I could step down now, but maybe you need a little explanation. So we go a little deeper. Now I try to get down to basics at a philosophical level here. I try to defend a position, philosophical position, which I and some other people call semiotic realism. You should know that realism has been an off concept in philosophy for centuries. We have to go back to the old world before the moderns, or in the start of the modern world. And here we go back to Descartes, the French philosopher living in the middle or the beginning, the first half of the 17th century, who founded, in a way, biology in modern sense of the word, because he, as the first person, tried to elaborate very precisely how the sense system worked, how the muscles worked, how the visceral system worked. And he did very detailed studies of that, and he founded a philosophy upon this sensory mechanics, we could call it. That is a mechanical understanding of how the senses work. But the problem, of course, that this leaves us with is how can sensory impressions become thoughts? How can they become ideas? And if you don't see that problem, let me try to explain it a little more detailed. I remember in my, maybe it was high school days or even before high school, the teacher told us that babies would see the world upside down, because that's when we had optics. So the light would go into the lens and then it would be projected on the retina, and of course it would be turned upside down. So the babies would see the world upside down. She calmed us, she told us, well, in a couple of weeks the baby would turn around the world. But if you take that view, you have a problem, because it presupposes that somehow the image of the retina is projected up to a screen in the brain, and then somebody must look at that screen and tell you what you see. So you must have some little person, a little man, a little homunculus sitting inside your brain, and this man is looking at a fried egg, I think, and so the little homunculus is telling the man, now you're seeing a fried egg. Okay, maybe that's a good explanation. We have such a little man? No. Or they talked about sensor processor. That was it when we should explain thinking. There's a central processor in the brain who does the thinking. That's the little man, isn't it? So the problem with this little man is that if he should be capable of telling us we're seeing a fried egg, then there must be another homunculus in his brain telling him that he is seeing a fried egg, so that he can telling me that I'm seeing a fried egg, and so on and so on. So this explanation is what we call homunculus explanations, and I mean it doesn't really explain anything. So what is it seeing? How can sensory mechanical things suddenly occur as seeing? It's not a simple problem. So Descartes, the philosopher who coined all these things, he was no fool, he was a very clever man. He saw that the phenomena of human thinking implies that in addition to sensible things, which he called the res extensa, there must also exist stuff without extension, for human thoughts have no physical extension. So thus another principle would be present in humans, a principle which he called res cogitans, thought substance, we could say short. Logically. The problem, of course, with this dualism, which we call it when we have world explained by two very different concepts. The problem is, how do they work together? How in the mind in the brain of the people do those two things manage to somehow mix? And nobody was ever, since Descartes, ever capable of explaining how this worked. And very soon it was given up. And instead, the dualism was split into the two halves, the two monisms it had united. Some people studied res extensa, that's the materialists, that's natural science, that's medical science, and reductive determinism and all this stuff. And some other people studied res cogitans, idealism, humanism, phenomenology. So we just have our universities today split into those res cogitans faculties and res cogitans faculties. Yeah, that's how it is today. And yet, of course, Immanuel Kant, probably the most important of the philosophers, he saw that a consequence of the Cartesian philosophy was that human cognition had to be produced by the tools of res cogitans, ideas and concepts. But how can we be sure, and that's the problem, how can we be sure that our ideas and concepts has anything to do with the external world if they are produced entirely inside our res cogitans, inside ourselves? And Immanuel Kant, as we all know, replied that we can't. We can never come to know das Ding an sich, as they say in German, the thing für mich, the thing as such, but only the thing für mich. The only, what do you say? For me. I'm sure, sorry. So, this is the dualism we have lived with, actually. We live with it. Natural science and humanities are split into this still today, as if it was true. And yet here we sit and we have both parts in us. How can that be true? So that's the problem we have to deal with. And in the hospitals, of course, that's where it really became acute. This picture of this soulless human being as a pure chemistry or whatever was a big problem. The nurses then had to get in and bring that element of common humanity or brotherliness into healthcare that the medical science had no theoretical concepts for. Now, I'm not saying that the doctors were not clever or human. Of course they were. They knew very well that you had to be somehow feel empathy with the patients. It's not that they didn't know it, but their theory, the universities didn't explain that. It didn't exist in the theory. It doesn't exist inside medical theory. It's something external. You go to psychiatry or whatever. And it's out of this unsustainable situation that we get psychology, of course. So psychology had to take up what is lacking in this picture. Now the problem is that just because we have a physical science studying the chemistry of the human body, does that mean that we have a psychologist studying the psyche? What is the psyche? Does it exist? Do we have a psyche? Well, you probably think we have. But I would say, well, I'm skeptic. Now listen to what the German Jewish philosopher who had to flee for, lived in the United States, what he said about this dualistic understanding. You can see over there, the soul is leaving the dying man. Of course, it's its role is to go on in the next generation, of course. So now it's leaving the dying name. And that's the whole idea of this. So what he says is the body as such is a grave. It's seen as a grave of the soul, and bodily death is the latter's resurrection. Life dwells like a stranger in the flesh, which by its own nature, the nature of the corporeal, is nothing but corpse, seemingly alive by favor of the soul's passing presence in it. This is a picture, actually. We should see it. It's a picture medical science is built on. So I have to step in and say this can't be true. What I would say that the only way to transcend this dilemma is by replacing the sensory mechanics with what I'm calling sensory semiotics. And this now was what the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, who very few people know today, saw more than 100 years ago. And yeah. So here he is. And what he said is, now you know we have analytical philosophies more or less based on the neurobiological understanding of the world, saying that experiences, all this is more or less not explainable. Now, you have the phenomenologists on the other, the humanities, saying that mind is real and it's irreducible, intentional, and it's not explainable. Now, what this man said was, mind is real, it's irreducibly intentional, and it's explainable naturalistically. And that's what biosemiotics intends to do. So what do I mean? What do I mean about sensory semiotics? Now, if you have the res cogitans understanding, you have the left side here. So she is seeing this red fruit, and she's thinking apple, and then he thinks, well, apples are eatable, maybe I should eat it. Now, sensory semiotics has it another way around. It says, this little girl see it, and immediately she thinks, or maybe she doesn't like it, and then she, well. But anyway, it reaches her as sign, as a signification, something which signifies. It's not reaching her as a concept. The concept is the Cartesian res cogitans thing. But signs are something different. Signs are something which signify. So signification is the core thing here. Things signify things. And then we can start thinking about it afterwards, not the other way around. So that's what semiotic realism is. We can know about the world because it inevitably assumes signification. Our sense apparatus does not mysteriously produce internal conceptual models or representations of the world. Instead, we are embedded in the world as meaningful from the very first second of our life. Only through our analytical skills afterwards can we scientifically learn to designify it, and that is very important. That is what I've spent my life doing. That is what we should all try to do. Try to designify it. It's very, very significant from the very beginning. And science is about how we designify it. Very important thing to do. But don't forget how it all started. It started by signifying. So, next thing is biosemiotics. I'll have to tell you what this is. It's a theory of life's creative agency. Biosemiotics is the study of living systems from a semiotic, or that is a sign theoretic perspective. Now, science theory is called semiotics. That is, we'll come to it in a moment. Biosemiotics claims that life processes are organized in obedience to a semiotic dynamics. Molecular structures are not just molecules. They are molecules, of course. They are also signs, or nearly always capable of entering into significative processes. That's the fundamental idea. And just to give you some example at the levels here, we usually hear about DNA as a sequence of bases, A, C, T, G, A, C, T, G, and so on and so on. But it's also a spatial structure. It has to be, as you see, it has to be fixed around this nucleosome by help of a number of different proteins. I think there are maybe 15, 16 different proteins called transcription factors, which posit it in a spatial way so that exactly at this locus, the polymerase enzyme can start transcribing the gene. And all of those many factors have to be there for this to happen. Now, they only are there if somehow everything is prepared for the transcription of this gene, which presupposes a lot of communicative processes of the cell which is doing this with all the other cells. And to the left, if you can see it in this slide, you can see the protein molecules in yellow maybe. It has to bind inside this helix. It's not just about a sequence, it's a spatial thing. There's a lot of sign processes involved in this. Now, terminological to avoid confusion. The sign in Greek is called semion. So the sign process is called semiosis. That is, if I see a black cloud and I'm going to walk, then I pick up my umbrella. The cloud signifies. It's a sign telling me that it will probably be raining. That's the sign process. Most sign processes of this kind are probably quite unconscious. We don't even notice them. We just do them. We interpret them unconsciously. So the science which studies this semiosis is semiotics. So biosemiotics is the science which studies these kind of things as they occur in living systems. And a sign, of course, is something that refers to something else. Now, most of you very skilled image readers of your generation immediately can see that this is faked, of course. But anyway, it's fun. So, the important thing about signs are they show us something. Here, it's burning over there, isn't it? Well, actually it's not. It's a tornado. That's the problem with signs. They may be misunderstood. They may be misinterpreted. So they're very different from causes. Causes are coercive. I mean, they have to be obeyed. You can't have the moon suddenly to think, now I have circled the earth for so many billions of years. Now it's enough. I don't want to do that anymore. That's impossible. It's coercive. It has to do it. But science, well, that's another thing. Here's some kind of, you can't know what happens. And here, of course, somebody has walked, but it takes some skill to know if it's a woman or a man, doesn't it? I wouldn't be able at least to tell. And I might err. Now, at another level, here we have the growth cone of an embryonic cell. Now the task, this cell, it's growing out from the, what is it in English? The spine, the middle, marrow, spine marrow. Anyway, it's growing out from there. And it has to find a muscle somehow in the body to innovate. Now, if I do this, well, then my brain has to tell down my spine marrow and out to my finger that it should do this, because otherwise, how should the finger know to do this? So, I mean, it doesn't know it itself. I don't think it does. So, the task of this is that for this to succeed, of course, every muscle in our body has to be innervated with a nerve cell, and this nerve cell, of course, like all the others, growing from the spine marrow, will have to find this, find this little muscle. And it does it by sending out every second, many times, every second, those small philopodia, which sort of senses what is going on, feels its way along attractant, repulsants, chemicals, tactility, surfaces of cells. It has to grow along many surfaces of cells. And finally, if it succeeds, it will find a muscle. If it doesn't succeed, it will die. So that's kind of how it works. It's all about feeling its way. It's all about interpreting signs, coming to it. Here another example I saw just recently. This is fruit flies, those little things you have in rotten bananas. Well, when they are mating, they apparently run through a whole ritual of things. And one of the steps, as far as I can see, it's one of the first steps, they have to sing, or the male have to sing. I don't know how that's to listen to. I just read about it. Anyway, the interesting thing is, at the moment the male fruit fly starts singing, the female fruit flies start to transcribe genes that are necessary for the eggs to maturate in the follicles. So somehow the coordination of the mating is put down into chemical processes or semiotic processes going on inside. Now, the fruit fly's ovaries have no ears, so it can't hear the male singing, of course. So it must be somehow communicated to the brain, which then communicated down to the ovaries. This is another example of sign processes or semiotic processes which coordinate what happens in the body. So now to be technical about it, what is a sign? The first thing to say is a sign in a technical semiotic sense is not something which exists. It's not something which is there. It's something which happens. It's a process, it's an action. Take the example of smoke. Smoke provokes the formation of an interpretant in the animal, causing it to flee. The animal is seized by alarm. This being seized by alarm is exactly what an interpretant is. And you see the scheme from Charles Peirce's understanding of the sign process. You have the sign. Don't let you confuse that I call it a sign. I'll get back to that. You have the sign. It causes the formation of an interpretant referring to an object. Or in the other half, you can say the smoke creates fear in the animal because it somehow relates to danger. It shouldn't be fire there, it should be danger. Or we cannot know. Maybe the deer does know that this has something to do with fire. Maybe it has experienced that, but probably not. Probably this is more or less instinctive, but it doesn't matter. The logic of the process is the same. Something provokes the formation of an interpretant, which then causes it to flee. And this interpreter relates the sign to an object. Now, I call it a sign. I know that is confusing, that because I prefer to speak in everyday language. And we call it a sign. We call the smoke a sign. But of course the smoke is not a sign. A baby sensing the sign will not turn its head to see where it burns, because for the baby it's not a sign. Or if it is a sign, it's a sign for something which was like it maybe sometimes earlier. And that's an icon. It's not, as this is an index, it indicates fire. As adult persons, we know it indicates fire, but not always. If we are in a theater, it might not be real fire, it might be theater fire. So we cannot know really. So that's another thing about the sign. It's a triadic relation happening instantaneously, connecting something to something else. And the interpretant is all that, all those processes that makes this connection. And if you go down in biosemiotics and study it in detail, of course this is a whole chain of interpretative processes. One interpretant becoming the sign in the next process. So you can analyze it down to the deep thing. What is important here is this is a triadic process. In natural science, we would always work with causes. Fire would cause smoke. Well, but it takes somebody to know it. That's when we go from the causes to the interpretation, to the interpretants, to the sign processes. So, and I have to be short here. You need to listen to me for several hours, but well, the totality of messages and cues in the world is a semiosphere. We have the concept of a biosphere. That's a very reductionistic concept. It only considers streams of energy, of nutrients, and so on and so on. What we really need to study is the semiosphere, the totality of messages and cues. It penetrates the biosphere. It consists in sign processes, sounds, colors, odors, movements, colors, electric fields, waves of any kind, and many, many other things. And actually, this is what we love about nature. It's all the signs, it's all the odors going in the forest. It's not this streaming energy. It's not all those ecological concepts. Ecology or environmental movement should move into the semiosphere. That's where we trigger our emotions. Yeah, and we have concepts of semiotic niche. I should take care not to speak too long here. So, we should understand the world as emerging thing through semiotic emergence. I mean the establishment through evolutionary processes of higher level organization based on situated semiotic exchange between subcomponents. The important point is that the emergence of higher level patterns is the result of a semiotic and not just a physical interaction between entities at the lower level. That makes a lot of a difference from other understandings of emergence. I thought I have skipped all this. Okay, jump it over. Somehow I have opened it wrong. I had made it better, but anyway, I have to stay with this, otherwise it gets wrong. So the third part of this is a short, I think. I just want to try to focus your attention on the self. I think the self is the most misunderstood concept today. People talk about realizing themselves as if they had selves. Well, I'm not so sure. They don't have selves, they create selves, do I say. and they don't realize something they don't have, of course. Yeah. So, now, seen from a biosemiotic view, the psyche is not a mysterious appendage to neuronal processes in the brain. And the body is not, on the other hand, a lifeless support for an illusory world of experiences. The body is one huge self-organizing swarm of swarms of communicative processes, and our psychic preparedness is nothing other than the illuminated part of this swarming whole, the tip of the iceberg, as we often say. Now, this of course poses a problem. The metaphor of the illuminated body swarms presupposes an agency. Who is in charge of this agency? Someone has to direct the light toward that which should be illuminated. So who is the agent? Many people always think that consciousness is somehow what directs our will or whatever we do. But I don't think that. I don't think consciousness is so strongly connected to what our wants really are. Knowing from, you can see me having a lecture on Elsinore here. I don't hope anybody knows those persons. Because I ascribe some fantasies to them which they surely didn't have. Anyway, the consciousness is very, it's a very fluent thing. In the next moment it may well be somewhere else. It's scientifically proved that everybody listening to a lecture in 45 minutes will at least 2 or 3 times be somewhere else in the world. So their consciousness is not at all present. That's how it is. So consciousness is not what is important here. And Storm Petersen, the Danish cartoonist, said it very well. When the unconscious become conscious, it happens quite unconsciously. He was clever. He did know that. Oh. So what about responsibility? Oh, I had a much better picture for that. Sorry. Damned. I don't know what happened here. No, well, but it's the text which is important. Isn't it? So it's not consciousness that makes us responsible individuals. It's our life historical self. Through our life, this self evolves. And from time to time, it really undergoes deep structural redeployments. Our personal life story has left millions or even billions of indelible traces in our body and brain, like buoys in the sea. These traces guide the way we navigate through life. And these traces are what make us just who we are. They reflect our life story and they act as a semiotic scaffolding of our personality. Our agency is embedded in these life historical scaffolding patterns, and they will change as we change. So I would like you to pay attention to this concept, semiotic scaffolding. I think it's a very important concept, that somehow the whole thing of our bodies and brains is scaffolded by communicative interactions which have been sort of fixed by other communicative interactions. I'll show you just one example of that. Kids do not just copy the movements of adults. They map them upon their own body feelings. Step by step, the child moves forward through a series of stages corresponding to the establishment of new semiotic scaffolding patterns. but the tissues, organs, muscles, brain, and so on, get into an semiotic interaction which act as a scaffolding for what goes on. As soon as some activity has become scaffolded, consciousness is no longer needed for that activity and is directed instead towards new challenges, the establishment of new semiotic scaffolding patterns. And this perpetual development through life of new semiotic scaffolding patterns is what makes us whom we are. And we can do a lot to evolve, to develop those skills that we do want to know and scaffold them semiotically. So the next section of this is an evolutionary section. I would like to turn attention to what created all this. Now, a very important question here, of course, is the origin of life. I hope you will excuse me that I don't consider that. It's probably, for some of you physicists, will it probably be the most important question, but that's another lecture. So I try to introduce a term here. I would like you to remember it if you could. The semiome. The semiome of an organism may be defined in an analogy to the genome as the entirety of its semiotic toolset. We already had this concept of the genome as the entirety of an organism's hereditary information. Now, people think that the genomes are the only thing determining us. It's not. The genome is in a perpetual interaction with the semiome. Those two factors are sort of interacting all the time, and reducing our life to one or the other would be equally foolish. So the semiome is the means by which the organism may extract significant content from its surroundings and engage in intra or inter-specific communicative behavior. The semiome thus defines the scope of the organism's cognitive and communicative activity. And just to give you an example, the moth semiome, the moth lives in a totally mute world, apart from one particular tone note, which is this frequency of 20,000 hertz, which is the frequency used by bats to chase it. So if the bat is close on, the moth will make some sudden, totally irregular movements and maybe escape that. But the idea is that the moth semiome is very simplistic at the auditive level, at least. Only has one tone in it. And if you see the semiome, like the genome, as something which has developed evolutionarily, and you should study that, of course, to the same extent as you study the genome evolution. So to extend the scope of one's cognitive and communicative capacity must be one way to avoid extinction. And for obvious reasons, this strategy were more profitable for animals than for plants and fungi. And you can see, so the organism to the right here is, of course, have developed much more semiotic freedom, you would say, than those on the left side. Very early in Metazoan evolution, we already find the first archaic brains, and we find considerable brain capacity in arthropods and cephalopods and octopuses and so on. Octopuses actually may have 168 million nerve cells. Now, that's a lot, but it's very far from human brains, which have 100 billions of nerve cells. Anyway, with a colleague, Christiania, I once tried to list some steps here on the cognitive development. Physicists sometimes like to talk about life or even consciousness as something which is exhibited at very, very low levels, even at quantum levels, I think. And biologists, of course, would think that consciousness is, well, you need at least brains, probably big brains, to exhibit consciousness. So there's a lot of confusion here. This is just an attempt to somehow try to list a progression that we have a stepwise evolvement through evolution of more and more semiotic freedom, more and more cognitive capacity. I'll just run through very quickly because time is, of course, running out. Now, at the level of the jellyfish, like this one, this is 480 million years ago. 480 million years ago. We already have very modern kind of neurophysiology, multifunctional neurons, action potentials, synapses, and chemical neurotransmissions. Very early on. The flatworm is interesting because it has the first archaic brains. Now the flatworm is interesting also because it's a bilateral thing. This animal, of course, has a radial symmetry, but it doesn't have a bilateral symmetry. And the problem here, if you decerebrate a flatworm, it may still swim and crawl, but the movements will no longer be integrated. So it never stops eating, for instance, even if its gut is full. So without a brain, the worms apparently could no more make the saturated gut feeling become knowledge in the sense, I need not eat. That is a simple form of cognition, I would say. Yeah, well, I think we have to go through lots of interesting things to say about this little thing. Let me just say one thing. The bilateral anatomy means that you have a left and a right, and you have a forend and the back end. So the problem is, how do you coordinate what goes on the right side with that going on the left side? Probably that was what brains appeared for. So brains are essentially things to manage integration, coordination, communication inside organisms. Already in fish you can see, and now we go to the chordates because we have to end up with human beings and we are chordates, as you may know. Already in fish we can see a kind of social intelligence. Here we have the famous example of cleaner fish and sharks in this case. It may be a lot of different client fish, they call client fish. Now the cleaner fish likes, of course, they're supposed to eat the different little things infecting the, what's it called, anyway, they eat all those things which the shark wants to get rid of. But sometimes they, or even better, they like to eat some of the slime, the shark's own tissue. And of course the shark doesn't like that. So that gets a kind of arms race there. So the cleaner fish try to get away with eating a little bit, then the sharks will chase them away. And if a shark sees a cleaner fish doing that to another shark, then the shark will not let this cleaner fish get near it anymore. So they're kind of trade-off there, which clearly shows us that there's kind of social intelligence there. If you go to the reptiles, and reptiles are, I mean, it's a group of animals that are so different. I mean, you have crocodiles in one end, and then you have snakes in the other end. and turtles are probably quite primitive. Nevertheless, this captive turtle in Washington D.C. Zoo plays with the basketball. Now, if it's playing with the basketball, wouldn't you think that somehow it must have a sentience, it must have an experience of this ball? Maybe the experience disappears the moment the ball is away. It's a very different kind of experience from the experience we have. But in that moment when it plays with it, probably it has it. I'd miss Bob. And we can't even know how often we don't have experienced it ourselves, because we have never experienced it for good reasons. Or have you? I guess not. So we go to the mammals, of course. Mammals and birds, of course, are the real winners here in this context. Ravens are highly sophisticated when it comes to assessing their adversaries' degree of knowledge. When ravens discover a wolf bearing a piece of meat, they watch him openly, and when he leaves, they just dig it up. But when it comes to their conspecifics, other ravens, they act demonstratively uninvolved. They are looking away and seem as if they, no, I haven't seen a thing. Yeah. So they obviously don't think the wolves are very smart. Perhaps they are not. I think the ravens are really clever animals. Now, the idea, of course, was that you talk about the psychic problem. So this was just an evolutionary introduction to that. So minding the human body. Now we should not forget, and that's what the idea of producing this evolutionary story, should never forget that human psychological system is a very recent newcomer in evolution. There were bodies long before there were brains, and brain is there to serve the body, not the other way around. So, in the moment we go from the traditional chemical approach to the understanding of body function with a science-theoretic or semiotic approach, well, then we enter a no man's land. Nobody has ever had been in this land between the social and the biological, and that's where we need to come. That's in Danish. I have translated them, yeah, it's another version then, I'm sorry. Since semiosis is vital to communication at both levels, the sign process is an obvious choice as the basis for an integrated theory of human nature. Now, I think you understand this. Semiosis works both domains of it, connects them actually. You can easily connect from the psychic level to the bodily level through sign processes, and that makes biosemiotics a paradigm for how to integrate those two areas into one science. I don't mean we should reduce social science to biology, that's not the object, but we should try to understand how social science, how psychology could be possible at all, seeing it from a biological perspective. So biosemiotics sees meaning and signification as inherent to the body proper, and not as outsourced to some nondescript location in the brain or mind. Whatever the mind is, it is also body. Body in a semiotic sense of the word, not in this physicalistic sense, or Cartesian sense, which science sees the body in. A body that is inherently engaged in communicative processes that serve to coordinate the activities of cells, tissues, and organs inside the body, and to calibrate them with the needs derived from the outer world. And this calibration, of course, is what it all was all about. How do things happening in our brain become calibrated to the organs, to the endocrine hormone production, to the glands, to the immune system. And we know it does. So we need a theory to say how can this calibration take place. So biosemiotics is a frame of thinking which I think gives us some way to perhaps operationalize these events. So we come to my idea that the mind should be seen as an interface. The mental system or mind may be seen as an interface through which an organism manages its coupling up onto the surrounding web of things, natural or social. The mind thus is not a thing and has no more distinct location than the electronically mediated processes whereby a changing pattern of pixels is at each moment shaped on the screen. Let's skip that. You know what an interface is. The mind interface makes the world comprehensible to the organism by triggering emotional, cognitive, and/or motoric activity, muscular, endocrinological, immunological, and neural memories are incessantly activated and brought to bear in interpreting the world as it is presented to the body through the mind's activity. Our mind behavior is thus deeply ingrained in the social, cultural settings of our lives. Now, all this neurobiology, which is of course extremely important science, and people are doing very fine work. I'm sure that Albert Kjede, who was here, is doing very fine work. But the problem is that somehow the body very indirectly enters into all this. What biosemiotics claim is that you can't separate those two. You have to all the way through the thing, the body process, into the brain processes. It's not as simple as you have a computer here who does the thinking, the feeling, the emotion, and so on and so on. You have to integrate it into the body. I don't think the traditional way of thinking can do that. So therefore I suggest some modifications. Yeah, that's the books you could read in English. I should perhaps have brought also the slide with the Danish book, if you think this is worthwhile pursuing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions to Jesper. I can see one there.
I think, yeah, it's all right. So it seems that biosemiotics is very concerned. It seems that biosemiotics is very concerned with indexical science, not iconic or symbolic. If that is so, what would you say is the difference between semiotic scaffolding pattern and Damasio's somatic marker?
I'm very much impressed by Damasio's work. I think his somatic marker hypothesis is a very important part of it. Now, but it's not wrong. It's not true that biosemiotics is only concerned with iconic and indexical science. But going into the symbolic science is, of course, mostly for human beings, and so I skipped it out here. But I see a very close. I mean, I disagree with Damasio in many respects. I don't think he is healing the error which Descartes did, as he calls his first book, Descartes' Error. I think he is a very Cartesian thinker, but nevertheless, he has made a very important contribution, I think, by this somatic marker hypothesis.
Question just here.
Do you have a quantitative way to interpret your theory?
No. Well, I just wrote a paper, many years ago I wrote a paper in which I said, this was about biosemiotic technology, and I said that the agricultural practices should obey a equation which was S divided by E should always be greater than or bigger than 1. And I, of course, it was ridiculous. The problem is that S should mean semiotic freedom, whereas E should mean energy flow. And though the idea was you always have to compare the size of the semiotic freedom in the kind of agricultural practice you have with the energy flow through it, and then the semiotic freedom should be bigger than the energy flow. Now that's nonsense, of course, because you can't measure semiotic freedom. That's the whole idea of freedom. If you could measure it, it wouldn't be freedom. So somehow we have to accept that some things can't be measured, but it doesn't mean they are not real.
Thank you, that was an interesting answer also. Here's another question on the right side of you. Hello. I have a question on your example about the cloud.
I'll have to go also. Yeah, I can see
you said you would. You said initially that instead of thinking of the signification, we should think of that we have to designify things. And maybe this is just a policy of science, but just is it really the case that everything, in your perspective, that the meaning is there first? Does the cloud mean rain first, and then we have to analyze and see, no, it doesn't? Or is there maybe some other process that actually brings the signification?
I know. I have to admit, of course, that making a lecture in a very short time, I have to be a little provocative. And of course, you're right. You can't put it like that. What I tried to stress by saying this was that we should not forget that the way we perceive the world initially, as children and so on, even through adult life, is always through its interactions with our direct signification it has. But then, of course, in science, in school and so on, we gradually learn to build conceptual structures which we then collectively discuss, and maybe those conceptual structures are clever, maybe they are not. Most of science is about those conceptual structures. I find that very important. And I would even say that, of course, when we have dealt with conceptual structures for a number of years, we get some feelings for the signification of this. It takes on some new significations. So it's an exchange between those two levels all the time.
When it comes to creating, to culture, even to engineering, it's about creating meaning rather than designifying it.
Well, you can frame conditions of living. As an engineer, you can frame the conditions of living in a way so that human populations can create meaning. You cannot create meaning as an engineer as such, but you can frame the world people live in so that people have a chance to create meaning in it. The design in which context? Okay.
Could you repeat the question, please?
No, the question is about what about design, art or engineering or whatever, design things which gives people meaning, I suppose you think. But well, I'm not trying to take anything from the artist or the engineers, but still I would maintain that the people who enjoy the art somehow have to attract the meaning, to draw the meanings you can give them the chance to get an understanding of things and a vision or something, but you can't induce it upon people.
I think we're a bit pressed on time, so one last question here.
Thanks for a good talk. Two kind of questions. One, I think you have a very ethnocentric view of this.
Where are you?
Over here.
There.
In the lab coat.
It's hard to see.
Sorry. You have a very ethnocentric view on this. Can you talk about other forms of semiotics that maybe we're not picking up as humans that are kind of present in other species? Is kind of one sense. And then the other is, what about going beyond just a single organism and kind of more groups of animals, semiotics?
Yeah, interesting. This is a very hard question, also something which we have to discuss in biosemiotics. It's probably not studied enough, but obviously, when you have unities of populations of organisms together, of course they create subcultures, if you like, and as such, they get some scaffolding at the level of the population or of the subculture, if you like. So, of course, we can extend this, and I think the semiotic freedom, of course, I don't think any other species than the human species have attained this extent of semiotic freedom, but I think that cultural evolution very much consists in the furthering and further development of semiotic freedom through art, through printing press, through all these things, which means that every generation inherit semiotic scaffolding systems, cultural semiotic scaffolding systems, which makes it much easier for the new generation to understand the world than their parents had. So that's how the human culture sort of develops into new areas of still more semiotic freedom. You can think of the World Wide Web as a kind of semiotic freedom, which, I mean, didn't exist when I was a child. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question.
Unfortunately, you're running a bit late, so we have to move on. We'll be taking a 10 minutes or so break, in which time we'll distribute 3D glasses, because there's a 3D musical performance coming by Søren Lyngsu, or otherwise known as Spectral. And so please take a small break, but stay here for a very interesting musical performance. Before that, let's thank Jesper Hoffmeyer.